Good evening, Professor Dolores Cale. Thanks a lot for giving us some of your time. You're a professor of immunology and microbiology, and we are going to talk about your views on the pandemics, what's really happening with respect to treatments, and focus on vaccines and as it is the topic of the moment. Maybe by way of introduction, you can say a few words about yourself, what you do, how did you get into this topics and subject of science, and what are the main issues that you cover?
That's great. Thank you, Xavier, for the opportunity to be interviewed this evening. And just to say, my background is in molecular biology and in immunology, and I'm a professor in translational science. So that is actually in translating laboratory findings to society, so either to prevent or to improve the diagnosis of disease or to policy for the government. And that actually involves areas around commercialization and innovation and comparing different aspects. So it's really trying to move research from publications and journals to try and benefit society and people. And my area was around the improved diagnosis of autoimmune diseases and improving the diagnosis of assays, such as antibodies that are used in diagnostic assays, antibodies that are used in research or in pathology. And from about 25 years ago, I was involved with a whole team of people in developing high content protein arrays and high content antibody arrays. I was one of the lead principal investigator of a group in the Max Planck, and we patented that technology. The patents were granted worldwide and licensed, including in the European Union and in America. And some of the main applications of that was to look at the specificity and cross-reactivity of antibodies. And a lot of my research, we realized that a lot of the publications in this area were not accurately reflecting what they should have done. And so for 25 years or so, I've been involved in trying to say that validation of scientific results and results in medicine is how those developments in science and in medicine and research should be characterized. And that's how people should get promotion, not just on publications alone, but on that independent validation of the results and independent verification, and that people should be required to submit the tools like antibodies or proteins or libraries to repositories or biorepositories where other people can check out the tools that they are claiming and that are the basis of their publication. And that's an area of research integrity. And I was very surprised when I was doing my research that a huge significant proportion of the research was not correct, and that there was resistance within the scientific and research community for correcting that. And I, 20 years ago, was involved in advising governments on how to best use the funds that they get from the people of their countries and the taxpayer to have the best impact, which requires analyzing, what science is done from a whole country or a whole world perspective, which not so many people would be done. But I came from the background that, which is now well known, a lot of this, even published papers, are incorrect and inaccurate. And that is then leading to government decisions and health policy that is based on things that are incorrect. And I also have been advising the European Union. I was on the Government Advisory Science Council, a voluntary role for 10 years, the EU as an expert for 15, 20 years. And I also worked in the European Commission in a unit which combined policy and science called the Global Coordination Unit. And I was coordinating between the European Union and China, South Korea, in all aspects of research and innovation. But also I was responsible for coordination of health worldwide, including during the Ebola crisis in 2013, 2014.
Okay, well,
and the last thing, I suppose I did work and I ran a biosafety lab as well, which is like up to class 2, 3. And maybe just to say, I realized in 2002, 2003, that the way the World Health Organization initially dealt with the original SARS was entirely inappropriate, where they still have on their website in 2020 that the mortality rate from the original SARS was 10%, where they just looked at 8,000 people in the world and 774 people in the entire world died in that flu season. Whereas if you spread it out from all of the people that would be exposed, you have a chance of dying from SARS of 1 in 1.8 million. And the same when they called the pandemic in March, the 11th of March 2020, the chances of dying in the world is 1.1 in 1.8 million. And they reported it as a death rate or mortality rate of 6% or 3.6%, which was entirely exaggerated. And the reason why we're here is that a lot of the discussions coming from governments and the World Health Organization, there isn't an open debate or open platform to challenge what they're saying. And a lot of scientists and even Nobel Prize winners for the last year are being censored. And there are, medical information and ways to reduce the fear and prevent and treat nearly all of the deaths. And because this health information is not getting out, the countries are in lockdown. And I said all along, there's no need for the lockdown. And therefore, if there's no need for the lockdown, because there are prevention and treatment, and it was entirely exaggerated, the fear, there's no need for things like social distancing or masks, and there's no requirement for the vaccine.
Okay. Just if I may, because you have a lot of experience with respect to integrity. One of the issues with respect to medical research has been the replication or the replicability of studies. Have you looked into that? Hello, Dolores, can you hear me?
You'll have to ask, I didn't hear you, so you'll have to ask that question again.
I will.
The internet.
The question was, since you have a lot of experience with respect to integrity, one of the issue that a lot of doctors and have mentioned to me is that it's very difficult to replicate a study and to replicate the results. Have you got some experience or something to say about the replication of the results of a study?
Yeah, well, I suppose 25 years ago, with many others, I was involved in negotiating with Professor Hans Lehrer and the Max Planck and many others around the government funding the resource center of the Human Genome Project that funded about 40 technicians for 10 years. And their role was that we submitted all of the libraries and clones and data that we were generating in the group of Hans Lehrer, and that then other people could analyze those data separately. So while it's not just replicating a study, it's that you make the original tools available and then people do the same procedure and see if they get the same results. So I have been lobbying for 20 years in various fora that a significant percentage of the funding from countries and the European Union should go on validating results that people have generated, repeating them.
Yep.
Or that you would have groups in sectors that would actually do replica analysis and see if the results, and also for 15 years or so, I've been saying that promotions in every aspect of science and medicine should be based on whether people put their tools like proteins, antibodies, clones, sequences, viruses in a public domain, and how good the results are, whether they are actually genuinely, and also that the statistical significance of the results are replicated. So many of the top journal editors have come out over the last 15 years and said that there are serious issues with even the research in top journals and in clinical trials. It's very easy to validate, and I would be very happy to be involved in a validation initiative in Ireland, Europe, or the world. It's quite easy to do. And in fact, we wouldn't have the issues of the lockdown of the world and the huge impact that will have for generations to come if there was an ethos or a mechanism to validate results. And that's why I'm now been involved in setting up the World Doctors Alliance and the World Freedom Alliance, because part of the thing that we can do in the event of something similar, that we will already have the networks in the world that we can potentially have committees that will look much quicker at what the international organizations and governments are doing.
So somehow the issues that we have at hand with respect to the various countries around the world and in Europe in particular, with respect to lockdowns, they don't seem to surprise you. You don't seem to be surprised by that.
No, I mean, there's like 100 years really of evidence, right? So anything that governments do in policy that causes huge amounts of unemployment, it is well known that that will have a huge negative impact on people of countries, right? So this has been done, we'll say, following the, from a social science perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a health and public policy perspective, and also in psychology. So if governments, so for example, in the 1930s, we had an economic downturn or depression. And then we had issues, when there were some countries where for political reasons, the economy, in some parts of the world has had a drag with with a reduced, income for people or a decrease in unemployment. And we also saw it after the financial collapses, we'll say, in Asia, in 1999, 2000. And also we saw it after the banking crash worldwide between 2008, 9, 10 to 14. And now we have it in the lockdown. So it is in every decision that you have to do as a president or a prime minister or people who are ministers or in health. It's a very common sense approach. It's harm. What will the harm of the measures do in comparison to the benefit? It's very simple, so that it is quantifiable and well foreseen in the lockdown that it would have a detrimental impact on businesses, including small businesses, family-run businesses, and that you can quantitate how much poverty, how many increase in heart attacks, in anxiety, depression, and because of reduced income, you have associated diseases of poverty, which would be around cancer, cardiovascular disease, depression, and increase in suicide. And so, as was before the lockdown, versus the number of people who would die from COVID-19. So those numbers were already available and on the WHO CDC website. So they had calculated 56 people per day died which would be the peak of the circulation of SARS-CoV-2 in China, Asia, and the Northern Hemisphere. And that was 56 people per day. And it was 4,291 people in the whole world in the period from December to the 11th of March. And so you have to compare with what would be the impact of the lockdown. And it was known that for every month of the lockdown, everybody will say in Europe would lose 1 month of life. So in Ireland, at that kind of rate, you would have predicted about 3 or 4 people would die. So it's about 1 in 1.8 million in the flu season in Ireland from SARS-CoV-2. Versus, we'll say, for 6 months of the lockdown now in Ireland, in a Swiss study in 2020, we will have lost 2.5 million years of life. So for 6 months of the lockdown in Ireland, on average, everyone in Ireland will lose 6 months of life. So you have, we'll say, in reality in Ireland, less than 100 people died in the flu season in Ireland versus 2.5 million years of life lost in the lockdown. And our unemployment went from 5% in February 2020 to over 25% by May 2020. It's predicted by Bloomberg, we'll have one of the most negative impacts. So the harm of the lockdown is hugely much worse than the harm from SARS-CoV-2. And also it's now well known that there are prevention and treatments like some of the safest winning a Nobel Prize. Vitamin D won a Nobel Prize, vitamin C a Nobel Prize, ivermectin a Nobel Prize, hydroxychloroquine is on the WHO Essential Medicine of the World in 2017. and zinc, so that we need to have hardly any deaths. It was well known, even from January, that these would prevent and treat. And so we could essentially in Ireland have hardly anyone. And therefore, if you have a disease that doesn't kill very many people, and obviously every death is sad, and then if you have Nobel Prize winning preventions and treatments that are one of the safest, you know, vitamin D and vitamin C, and hydroxychloroquine, zinc, then there is absolutely no need for the lockdown. And if there's no need for the lockdown, then there's no need for all of the other measures.
And do you believe that, what are the root causes of the government taking only the harm side as opposed to the benefit side of the? They've clearly made a trade-off. They had to make decisions. So what would be your explanation of their decision?
Well, I mean, that's so I would have looked into, obviously when I was looking into SARS, and then I've looked into all of the issues, you know, with the swine flu, avian flu, there's issues with this SARS, Zika virus, BSE, that we see this is maybe in 20 years that this similar issue happens, you know, every 2 or 3 years, and the response is entirely incorrect all of the time. So this isn't just a one-off, it's a continuation. Now, why this is happening in the world, that's really, I've been researching this for maybe 20 years, but it's really not the area that I wish to go into. But this is like, as we have seen, you know, in other vaccines, for example, narcolepsy, you know, was an adverse event associated with a rushed vaccine in a previous era where they were calling a pandemic for something that actually, it was entirely, the fear of that infection was also exaggerated, I would say, and that the adverse events of narcolepsy associated with a rushed vaccine will have and is having impact on people for all of their lives. And that is, you know, more than 10 years ago. So that this is a pattern that is going on multiple times. And the governments, there has been, you know, very good analysis of how the handling is entirely correct, not just from public health journals, but from business journals, economic journals, you know, people that look into how government policies and health interact, and the issues around adverse events associated with the vaccines exceeding any initial underlying disease that may be prevented. So this is, you know, in my 25 years of looking into this, just another cycle. So therefore, when people are aware of that context, then of course people like me would be speaking out, because this is the first time that it will come out, and the truth is already coming out, that this is probably the worst decisions that governments will make. Now, maybe when the government went into the Iraq war based on the weapons of mass destruction, which many people knew at the time there was no evidence for, which transpired to be the case. And we know that that killed, you know, millions of people in Iraq and the region, and led to societal unrest there, and, you know, decades of adverse events for that region. But I would say while the World Health Organization is really an undemocratic, unaccountable organization, they can in a way hold press conferences, but where the accountability lies rests on the shoulders of Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And in the United Kingdom and across the world, each individual prime minister, you know, is elected based that they make a decision. And the harm of this one was clearly known. And there were people coming out months before, like Nobel Prize winning Professor Michael Levitt, where he clearly showed that, you know, half the people were above 82, that on the analysis of the Diamond Princess, that maybe 1 in 200 people will actually have issues in the Diamond Princess, but most people will obviously come across the virus, develop immunity, as is the case, and not be affected. And that was clear across Asia and the rest of the world. So Boris Johnson made a huge mistake. It was obvious in the weeks beforehand, and the same as Dr. Leo Varadkar, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and across the world. So the question is, when it was clear that scientists before, during, and after that time were coming out, why did they censor those people and ignore them? That is the real question. And they will have to, I'm afraid they personally and individually made mistakes that will result in every day thousands of people dying unnecessarily, and people living in poverty and living with anxiety, and living with, we'll say, undiagnosed illnesses, people having stroke if the hospitals, when they didn't have such fear that they would go to hospitals. So the burden of the mistakes that are being made now for an entire year every day will rest on their shoulders. And if they are not capable of making decisions, then they should resign and let someone else do it, or call an election. And when I came out on the 11th of May 2020, I said for any country in the world that I would take responsibility for unwinding this, including that if I was to make a mistake and, if I was wrong. And I did predict that there will be less deaths, and that treatments like vitamin D, C, zinc, hydroxychloroquine, and zinc, and inhaled steroids and ivermectin were a way to treat this, not the way they were doing. And the things that I've said have turned out to be true. So I suppose each one of the prime ministers in the world, they will have to wrestle with their conscience, what they are doing. We're now into the 11th of January, 2021. Every day is entirely wrong. And when they are individually, have to come at the end of their lives and look back, what they are doing is really causing generational destruction on their individual countries. It is well known now that the PCR tests, for example, in these cases, and their clampdown and allowing of censorship of people who can prove that what they're doing, how the media is reporting it, is exaggerated and misinterpreted. And if politicians, the PCR tests have shown to be flawed, and that's actually a crime of malfeasance and malfeasance in public office. And also it's around the purchasing of the PCR tests because they're wrong, is actually them not investigating commercial misappropriation of funds, which is also a crime, and misrepresentation of the results, because each of those PCR tests should be sequenced. There is no such thing in PCR as a positive. It has to be sequenced. And I would predict that the PCR positive tests are probably not SARS-CoV-2, but are whatever circulating virus is circulating now, whether it's an influenza or an adenovirus or a different coronavirus. So therefore, what the medical profession and the media and the politicians are calling COVID-19 now, it will not be SARS-CoV-2. So the crime of malfeasance is 5 to 10 years in prison. And when I came out in May, because this is like the 8th time in 20 years, everybody are aware what they're doing is wrong. And I would say this kind of destruction and generational death, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths across the world, is a crime of contributory manslaughter on behalf of the prime ministers, the ministers for health, the civil service, their medical advisory boards, and the medical profession. It's entirely preventable, these deaths, and it's around either contributory manslaughter or malfeasance in public office, and does meet the terms of crimes against humanity.
Thanks a lot for that, Dolores. Just one question with respect to public decision and prime ministers or president's decision. Clearly, these individuals are not scientists, so they had to rely on some scientific evidence.
That's not true. But carry on with your question. That's not true. No.
Okay. Well, I'd like to get your views.
No, carry on with your question.
No, the question really is. Clearly, there are some scientists that must have provided reports or some forms to the civil servants and then to politicians for them to make decisions. And like, for example, in France, we have a scientific council formed of very highly respected professors. Some of them have been said to have had some conflict of interest or links with pharmaceutical companies. But well, since you started by saying that was not true, I'd like to get your views on what is not true.
So it's not true that, first of all, if you're prime minister and you're taking this decision, the decision relies on you, right? You cannot fob it off as an expert. If you've got a job to do as prime minister and you go elected, and this is tantamount to potentially leading a country into war, right? All of these decisions, which have huge implications, like the lockdown, or, you know, we'll say requiring or even issuing so-called guidelines about masking teenagers, or removing, you know, which is not at all correct, that people cannot travel, you know, outside of their homes, or the elderly can't leave their care homes. That decision actually rests on the shoulder of the person, of the prime minister. If they can't make that decision, they need to resign and get someone else. They cannot fob it off at experts.
No, that I fully understand.
Why this,
that I fully understand.
Yeah, but the reason why then the answer then is, you would say, how many people died, right, every year from influenza, right? Every year we have around 400 to 600,000. So 500,000 people die of influenza-like illness in the world. And we'll say in the Northern Hemisphere, where most of the world's population live, the flu season is between December and April, or we'll say October and April, right?
Yeah.
And so if every year 500,000 people die, the pandemic was been declared on the 11th of March. So you've had October, November, December 2019, January, February, March. So you're 6 months into a flu season that usually is gone a month later, right? In April, middle of April, usually. So then you just simply say to the World Health Organization, how many people have died from this virus? Almost, 6 months into a flu season, from October, the worst part, October to March. And it was 4,291. And on average, you have 500,000, right? So you then say, what percentage is that? It's less than 1% of the annual flu season from this virus as a causative agent of influenza-like illness, 1%. And then you would just say, no, this is not anything. This is with actually in the margin of error, plus minus, right? Obviously every death. And as Nobel Prize winner Michael Levitt predicted in January 2020, he said the peak of the deaths would happen in the week of the 18th of March in China, and that the peak would happen already in Europe about a week later, which was the case. Okay, so he was actually able to predict the peak, which went up in February and was already coming down. And so it was obvious that because coronaviruses are seasonal, every country in the world gets them for about 6 weeks, 2 months. And the reason why the peak is gone is that everybody is exposed to the virus, develops immunity, and then that's the end of that virus. And that was already tracked from January in China. So it had gone through a huge proportion of the population of the world, and it was less than 1%. And it was already been shown to be a Guppert's type analysis curve where the peak will rise within and drop within 3 weeks. So it was not a disease that was persisting in different countries. So at calling something, so I've used the analogy, it would be like if the radioactivity industry came and said, we have an emergency. In general, we want to do an action that will cause huge societal unrest, and the measure of, we'll say, locking people in their homes would cause huge negative impact for weeks. And then you say, how much is it relation to background radiation? And they'd say 1%. And actually it's dissipated. It's something that will happen, for 2 weeks and it's gone. Then as a prime minister, you just say, well, listen, plus or minus less than 1% of the background, what happens in either background or every year is just part of the normal flu season. And therefore there is no need. It's just common sense. 4,000 people. Normally we have the flu season is almost at the end. And it was well known, even in 2020, that vitamin D, C, and zinc and hydroxychloroquine and zinc had been known in clinical trials for the original SARS to work. It's on the World Health Organization, essential medicine of the world, one of the most safest, can be given to pregnant and breastfeeding women, that therefore there was no need for a prime minister to, as well, any prime minister, there were Nobel Prize winners coming out, publishing the data every day, putting their reputations on the line, epidemiologists, scientists. So, and, you know, even though they were meeting resistance, there was plenty of information. And of course, people like me were recording that because we knew that even though it may be removed from the internet, people like me and people around the world were recording all that information, downloading it. So in the event that obviously, you know, people in countries now can take cases, and I think they should, against individual prime ministers, because people are losing their livelihoods, children, you know, and people have committed suicide. And I think how we need to now restructure is that people need to be held accountable when they make decisions that kill and cause huge societal and family harm, that civil service and politicians and the media and individual journalists who are, you know, undermining the society and the structure of our families, not only now, but for generations to come. It's almost like they are putting our societies, ruining them as if we have been in a traditional war. And it's entirely unnecessary. And we have to learn from these mistakes.
That I can understand. But for every one of you, you've had doctors and specialists, like I can take one of them in the Imperial College, Mr. Ferguson, who predicted that if we didn't do lockdowns, then we would account for a lot of deaths. So obviously these predictions have proven to be erroneous, wrong, misleading, and therefore the political decisions that were based on that were erroneous. For every doctors who or scientists who have, I would say, come out in favor of the early treatments that you just mentioned, you had thousands of doctors or specialists who have, I would say, spoken against those early treatments.
Well, that's not true. If we just want to take your two examples, you see what you're saying is actually not true, right? Okay, so let's just look at Ferguson, right? Dr. Ferguson? Yeah?
Yep.
So this is his sixth time, yeah, where he has modeled, whereas he has been out by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. He's been entirely incorrect for BSE, for avian flu, for swine flu, for SARS, right?
So what you're saying is we should not have listened to him as an expert.
So I suppose you have to go on people's track record, right? So the thing is, I made definitive statements on the 11th of May, 2020, right? But what's more important is Nobel Prize winner Michael Levitt in January was saying in real time in January, specifically when real numbers, not modeling, would happen. And he was proved to be correct in January and February, right? Okay. Yep. So that means someone who puts their reputation on the line, and he was analyzing real data. If you've got someone like Dr. Ferguson, who there's at least 6 times, you know, with BSE and swine flu and SARS and this one, where he was out not only by 10 times, but in some cases 100 times. And he has ruined, like in BSE, the farming, you know,
yep.
And he ended up with people getting rushed vaccines, causing narcolepsy, causing them, you know, lifestyle or lifetime illnesses and adverse events for people who literally collapse and fall asleep. So it means they'll never be able to drive a car, potentially look after their children or have a job like teaching or medicine or police. Okay. So he has a track record of causing, you know, if you were to calculate the loss of earning of the farmers when he, you know, incorrectly said that BSE was going to kill thousands, and the same Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, SARS, all of the money that has been wasted, he was entirely wrong. Yeah, but the other thing of what's in, you know, you know, absolutely, I would say a crime of monumental proportions is that now every day we have the actual numbers of people that die every day in each country. And each country has exactly the number of hospital beds and exactly the number of ICUs. So in Ireland, for example, in January, February, and March, we had 0 deaths from COVID-19. And we had the same in March when we called the lockdown. There was no increase at all because the first death in Ireland was the 5th of April, 2020. Right? And what I'm saying is that even if a prime minister who was a medical doctor thought there was an issue, you just have to track, as Boris Johnson, the number of real deaths every day. And if you have huge capacity in the healthcare service and the deaths, because in the whole world, you had 56 people dying per day out of 200 countries. So that meant on average in a country, you had 2 people a week on average, right? You know, you have 300 people across the world. You have 200 countries. So on average, you were in each country, you had 1 extra person per day, you know? Therefore, there is no need, because you have huge capacity across the world, to actually call a lockdown. Okay?
Yeah, understood.
Yeah, you understand?
Yeah,
and also because Michael Levitt had already said 2 months before, this whole thing, like in the Diamond Princess and across Asia, would come and go within like 3 or 4 weeks in each region. So even if there was going to be 3 or 4 weeks, you just track. But since there was 56 people out of 7,000 million people, out of 200 countries, there was absolutely, all you'd have to do as a prime minister is say, we don't need to model. We have access to the real numbers every day, and we just have to wait. And another major thing is for prime ministers is we as a society are not there to protect our health service, right? Our health service is there to protect our health. And if there are some of the safest treatments of the world, right, then the question is, make the prevention and treatment available, right? So there was no justification. And if a scientist comes out who has a track record of exaggerating 10 or 100 times based on modeling, but there's no need to model when you have the actual numbers that were being analyzed correctly, including predictions, then there is no need. It's actually, that's why it's a crime of malfeasance and malfeasance in public office, right? Because you could say this to anyone in common sense. You have the real numbers, right? On the declaration, they're saying on average in 4 countries per day, 1 person will die, right? 56 people out of 200 countries. We have huge capacity. You can look at the deaths in real time. And you only have deaths because it's 100% prevented and treated. So what the analogy I've been saying is, it's like if there was a disease that could be treated with antibiotics and the healthcare system was not making the antibiotics available, some of the best treatments, if they had Nobel Prizes, and if you give the antibiotics early, the people can stay at home and not go into hospital. So the question is, why are you waiting, you know, saying people may die if we don't give them the correct prevention and treatment, right? And then you close down the country, and no journalists or people are saying, well, wait a minute, there is a huge, there are Nobel Prize winning safest prevention and treatment. They're working. They worked for SARS 17 years ago in clinical trials. They are working in Asia now. They're working everywhere. Why are they not been available? And that's why it is, it's malfeasance, right? Because an analysis of the actual data done by Nobel Prize winners, by people who are predicting what would happen with World Health Organization prevention and treatment, some of the safest in the world with 3 Nobel Prizes. Why aren't you making it available? And then you would have no deaths. But also the deaths were 1% of the annual flu season, almost most of the way through. Then there is absolutely no basis for calling the lockdown in March or ever. And the detriment to society every month. And so, of course, then to actually carry on, if you want to carry on something that's based on a false premise, is that you have to then silence or censor or intimidate or damage the reputation or fire, as we've seen, like some of the best doctors in the world are fired. The people trying to speak out are censored and removed from YouTube. And then the people who tend to be proposing, not actually basing the decisions on real data, have conflicts of interest, or they previously have a track record of misinterpreting the results. And they are somehow have financial benefit. And then in parallel, then the governments all around the world are actually trying to bring in acts of parliament to deny people free speech, the ability to meet, to discuss the issues, and based on the false premise that the virus is highly infectious and there's no treatment, which is a lie. But then unfortunately, incorrectly getting the medical profession to incorrectly write down causes of death, you know, where it was shown, was say Professor Puschel did 160 autopsies of COVID-19 in Hamburg, and not one of them actually died. They all died from other issues. The virus itself, the so-called causative agent, has not been put into an international repository. And then the PCR to test it, there are huge issues with the PCR test that has not been independently validated 10 months in, and has been shown to give positives if you don't do the test or if you put it onto vegetables or whatever, right? So, of course, as well, there's been huge issues of doctors putting COVID-19 down on death certs when people died of Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attacks, and terminal cancer. And of course, in Ireland, I've been helping the families for people who get COVID-19 death certs to contact me when they was clearly, you know, we had hundreds of families contacting us, tens of families that their loved one died of a heart attack, never had a COVID-19 test and was put down. And so that is all a crime on behalf of the doctors. To incorrectly put down a death cert is a crime of misrepresentation and forgery, and is 5 years in prison for the doctor. And if the family, when they object, the coroner doesn't investigate under the Coroner's Act, that's also a crime. And if the police don't investigate the doctors falsely reporting, that's also a crime. And lastly, I'll just say that on the 19th of March 2020 in the United Kingdom, they said that the SARS-CoV-2 was not a highly infectious disease. Therefore, there is no reason why autopsies cannot be done. So unfortunately, now we're in a situation where the medical profession and the coroners and the police have been involved in unlawful behavior, which is potentially not accurately reporting a death, which in a society, you know, how deaths are treated, it has to be very transparent, because people could be murdering people and that could be then covered up. And so this whole thing is now only perpetuating, was based on a lie initially, where a whole number of professions have got people in it where they are doing things that are not at the highest level of ethics, and maybe actually contributing to misreporting and forgery and calling something a diagnosis of death, which potentially can have the doctors and coroners struck off and the police not investigating. So we are asking people to provide evidence so that these will be held to account, because the whole thing is only working now because the doctors and coroners and the police, as we see every day, are engaging in unlawful arrests, unlawful entry into homes, not investigating crimes. But those crimes, you know, in the future will be investigated.
So it's another inappropriate use of public funds somehow.
No, well, I mean, obviously the whole thing is that you have people, basically doctors calling, we'll say, terminal cancer, putting COVID-19 on the death cert where there's no test, right? So yep. That is, you know, if a death cert is a highly legal area, right? So if someone wants to go around killing people, how do you do it? You know, if you want to try, and, you know, it's obviously a wrong thing to do. But if doctors start writing down causes of death that are entirely incorrect, literally, that person's death is recorded incorrectly. And that is contributing to the ammunition, in a way, in inverted commas, of the media and the politicians to perpetuate something that's incorrect. Whereas if someone died of Alzheimer's, then it should be Alzheimer's.
Should be,
because the COVID-19. And of course it is, because coronavirus is seasonal and people become immune to it in every flu season, that it is actually, I would say, not credible that last year's or 2 years ago's coronavirus is now the causative agent. I would say that, and I'm encouraging people around the world, and I've been in touch with lawyers, to say that people need to get their PCR tests sequenced, and that if the governments are saying you can't engage in education, or if you're a taxi driver or a waitress or a pilot, or an air hostess, that they need to sequence the PCR test if it's positive. And if it's not SARS-CoV-2, they need to take a case against their prime ministers and their ministers. Because I would expect that it's influenza or whatever the circulating influenza virus is. Yeah,
it's very clear.
But that means that
it's very clear.
Yeah, that means that the legislation is based on the causative agent SARS-CoV-2, right? So each of these prime ministers, they are spending millions on the testing, and where the criminality and malfeasance, and even as regards every member of parliament and every minister in every parliament, needs to get the PCR tests sequenced to make sure they're detecting SARS-CoV-2. Because if they're not, all of them are paying out and approving funding for testing, that they have not done their due diligence and duty of care to ensure that the governments are not misappropriating funds, and that people can hold individual members of parliament who voted for that without having the rigor. And I would be able to sequence in any country around the world, send for sequencing to forensics labs, the actual sequence of the PCR positive case. And I actually think, and I've been saying it to lawyers all around the world, this is how we can break the lockdown. That if you're required to keep your job, a PCR test, you say, okay, I will take 3 PCR tests and send one of them to your employer's lab, or if the governments force you to do it, to travel, 2 more to other labs for sequencing, get the sequence back. And if it is not SARS-CoV-2, they can then sue the government or sue their employer, but also sue the ministers and prime ministers. So I would say it's almost a biological impossibility that SARS-CoV-2 is circulating now a year and a half later. And the whole legislation, it's important for people listening, this will end the lockdown. The legislation is based on SARS-CoV-2. If what the doctors, and of course the doctors are also responsible, if they're diagnosing people with COVID-19, the doctors are required, and the GPs, to send so it is not normal at all that a PCR test is either PCR positive or negative. It has to be sent for sequencing. And the doctors should be, and pathologists should be sending those PCRs for sequencing. And if it's not SARS-CoV-2, if it's some other virus, then the doctors have to correctly say it's an adenovirus, a rhinovirus, an influenza virus. And then the disease is not COVID-19, it's a disease caused by another virus that gives influenza-like symptoms. And they should be then either, cause of death is cancer or some, Alzheimer's. Yeah.
Just one other question, because we spoken at length about the SARS-CoV-2. We hear a lot about the vaccine at present and the various vaccines. So obviously, from what you've just said, the vaccine is probably not a needed treatment in your mind. But can you explain to us what are your thoughts about vaccinations? What are the issues at hand with the vaccine right now? Because all the governments right now are pushing a lot of efforts behind vaccination. We've seen mass vaccination in the UK. We're seeing the same thing in France or in the US or in Israel. Don't know what's happening in Ireland. And one final question is, I've recently read in a French paper over the weekend that the Irish ICUs were getting close to the limit of their capacity, and I just wanted to to get some of your input on that.
Yeah, I think that you can actually look at the figures, and someone went around the hospitals in Ireland on the 6th of January. They did an analysis because I think a year or 2 years ago, the hospitals were at their highest waiting lists, you know, and then they went around the major hospitals and did videos, and the hospitals were, you know, no way near their capacity at all. So I think in the last few weeks, they're maybe half full, you know, the hospitals.
Okay.
So the way it is reported is, so say if the hospitals are at 50%, so, you know, we used to have the number of waiting lists and the number of beds. So those figures are easily seen, but I know I've had phone calls even today and yesterday that people have been in the hospitals and they are empty. So on the 6th of January, which is today's the 11th, all of the waiting rooms were empty, and the hospitals, some of the biggest hospitals in Ireland were empty, you know, the waiting rooms were entirely empty.
So the data that was reported in some of the French media are incorrect, what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I'd have to look at whatever, but I have heard that, you know, when the minister came out, it turns out, I think he then said in the interview, they were at 50% capacity, right? And that was then, you know, saying, well, they're, you know, that's quite a lot. But of course, other years, they were at 100% capacity on the 6th of January, you know, a year ago. But they had, we'll say, 700 people in waiting lists on trolleys, you know.
And
you know what I mean?
So that's very clear for me. And what about your views on the vaccination campaign that we're seeing right now?
So of course, my technology that I use was a way and is a way that you could potentially identify very straightforwardly what is the immune response when people are naturally exposed to a disease-causing agent. And then if it was like for me, meningitis, and you identify 8 meningitis proteins, that those proteins individually expressed and put into, you know, a antigen type vaccine could actually potentially elicit an immune response that would then protect people if they came across the causative agent in the future. So that it is entirely possible to make safe vaccines, but it depends on how you make them. And so in that case, you would not get, we'll say, meningitis from the vaccine, and meningitis proteins may on their own elicit a protective immune response. So that is to clarify that I'm not against vaccine in general, but it is what is in the adjuvants, what is in the vaccine, and are they necessary? Sorry. So then you have the issue that there are at least 50 or 60 vaccines in the pipeline against the causative agent of COVID-19. So that you have to, you know, in general, you would look at each vaccine on its own, you know, to see if it has been safety tested or not. So as we said, it's not necessary if you have prevention and treatment. And I suppose, as we said, that's the good news. A lot of those preventions and treatments will work every year for other, many other viruses, you know, influenza-like illness. So that's the kind of, and that also means that actually the influenza vaccines are probably not necessary, because it looks like the combination of vitamins D, C, and zinc, and then either ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine and zinc in preventative doses or early treatment can actually mean that we will have much less deaths. And all of those in combination are some of the cheapest drugs and preventions and treatments in the world, and some of the safest. So therefore, it actually means that we do not need, because there are a lot of adverse events associated with the vaccines, because some of the components in the vaccines are not necessary, in my opinion, like it was shown in a lot of studies, heavy metals that really damage the immune system and cause huge issues, such as mercury and aluminium that is still in some of the flu vaccines. We have titanium and cobalt and steel and nickel. You know, they should not be injected into people. They irritate the body, cause cognitive decline, you know, irritate, cause allergies, autoimmune diseases, and are entirely unnecessary. Okay, so I would say there needs to be, you know, independent analysis, and what I'm calling for as well is a biorepository, so that randomly we'll say 1 in 100 of all of the vaccines that are given need to be stored properly as evidence for future analysis, and also to be analyzed now, okay? Because it turns out, in my opinion, like in Ireland, 100 people or so have died between October 2019 and September 2020, and 8 people under 65 have died from COVID-19 officially in Ireland. And it looks like I just had heard of someone who was middle-aged dying, probably as the result of the PCR testing in Ireland. And there are deaths now coming out from the care homes across the world, and of nurses and doctors, that in my opinion, the deaths associated with the vaccines that are being given now, even just in the initial adverse events, which the CDC have said is 2.5%. So 1 in 40 people have adverse events because just of the initial reaction of the vaccination against COVID-19 in the first 5 days. That if you were to say in Ireland, you're talking about 2 deaths per million from COVID-19 under 65 versus 1 in 4 people, 1 in 40 people having an adverse reaction that means that they cannot function or work independently. You know, that the harm of the vaccine from the CDC figures in Ireland, for example, is multiple times more, probably 1,000 to 10,000 times more than the chance of dying from COVID-19. And in Ireland, they did not communicate the prevention and treatments, so that I would say most of those 100 people who died from COVID-19 were preventable deaths if the preventions and treatments had been given. So then you come on to the vaccine itself, and then the issue with around RNA vaccines is that not one vaccine for coronavirus has been licensed in the vaccine schedule, even though there has been huge amounts of research since the initial SARS in 2002-3. And the reason for that is that in the animal studies, when they injected the vaccine, the animals seemed to be okay. But when they were challenged with the vaccine again, the animals either got very sick or died. So you're talking about 20, 30, 50% of the animals. And in one study, all of the animals died. There was one study where they made an RSV vaccine, an RNA vaccine to respiratory syncytial virus. And that went into 35 children and babies, and 2 of the babies died. And a lot of the babies had adverse events. And of course, that vaccine was withdrawn. So there is 0 RNA vaccines before this on the American schedule. And the reason why they cause so much adverse events when you come across the next virus circulating. So in this case, if you were vaccinated for SARS-CoV-2 in December 2020, is that if coronavirus circulates in February, March, April, in whatever country you're in, we'll say in the Northern Hemisphere, or it could be next year, that the RNA goes into your body and starts expressing the virus protein because it's injected and you don't develop a proper immune response, you bypass it with the needle. And that RNA gets into your own cells, uses the machinery of your ribosome to make the viral protein. The immune system sees the viral protein in the body, starts making an immune response to it. And then when it comes across the virus in weeks or months later, it kicks out the virus. The immune system does quite quickly, but the immune system is ramped up. And then suddenly it starts to see that the spike protein is in cells in your body, in tissues and organs. And you start generating then an autoimmune response or an immune response against this spike protein, we'll say, from SARS-CoV-2. And the immune system starts attacking your own cells that has this protein, kills those cells potentially. The spike protein leaks out into your body, causes the immune system to ramp up again. And then it's a vicious circle. And the body attacking and causing an autoimmune disease itself will result in attacking the organs and the cells, and the immune system attacking yourself presents as sepsis. And when you keep attacking your own organs, you go into organ failure, and then people, die rapidly. So I'm saying that if you're over 70, that when the immune system ramps up, it actually takes away a lot of energy, makes you very weak and tired. And that if you combine that with people with underlying conditions, the exhaustion and illness from fighting the flu, and then from the immune system attacking the organs in combination with pre-existing conditions, I would say the vast majority of elderly will then die. And this is called antibody-dependent enhancement. And so this is an area of immunology, and the enhancement is known as that when you get vaccinated, you are enhancing the ill effects of the disease. So you're injecting people to enhance the worst reaction, and it's also called priming, super priming, cytokine storm, viral interference. Yeah, and it can work in various ways. That the vaccine the virus exposure by a subsequent vaccine followed by a subsequent virus in combination will just make it worse. Now, the good news is that you can give high dose vitamin C. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but I've to reduce the symptoms of sepsis. High dose vitamin C, or people can take vitamin C. So again, we have a simple preventative measure that can prevent death. But what worries me and concerns me is that we had simple, Nobel Prize winning treatments and prevention last year, and they were not given. And in fact, in Australia, a doctor can get 6 months in prison for prescribing hydroxychloroquine, even though it's been prescribed all around the world, and is also still prescribed for lupus and arthritis and malaria.
So clearly you're not against vaccine, but you're questioning the way this technology is being used, and it can turn, in essence, against the individual immune system. And this has.
And I suppose what I've now done is I've called it actually a kill switch or whatever. And I've also said clearly that I would not take one of those vaccines. I wouldn't recommend it for my family. And if you paid me, 10 million euros, I wouldn't take it. So just as we saw with, say, the 2 babies out of 35 in the study died, or in the animal study, significant numbers of people die. And we're seeing now as well, there are many deaths of doctors and nurses within hours or days of the vaccine. That is just the initial anaphylaxis from the vaccine, but the real enhancement of the illness and death, it's called antibody-dependent enhancement. The enhancement of illness and death because of the RNA will only come in the next flu season. So in like 2 months or in 14 months or whatever. That really, it's a Russian roulette type, nobody knows. So it's almost like if you were injected with peanuts and that instilled an allergy in peanuts, but you didn't know when, what was actually injected. So you go on your normal life, and then suddenly you will get very sick at some time in the future. So it's a Russian roulette. And for the elderly, I would say they will have much more illness and death because of the vaccine.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Dolores, for all of these explanations.
So it's really will to. I'm saying more.
Yep.
So what I'm saying as well, from a societal level, just so you know, is that it will be a drag on. So the issues associated with these particular vaccines are around the anaphylaxis seems to be around 2.5%. So 1 in 40 will have adverse events because of the first vaccine. These vaccines should not be given in a double dose at all, so that the anaphylaxis is always worse on the second one. So I've seen some reports, it could be as high as 1 in 10 people could have severe anaphylaxis on the second vaccine within a few weeks. And then the real issue with the enhancement, it's called antibody-dependent enhancement, where having the vaccine will make you more sick, could be 20 to 50%. So I would say for societies, that the vaccines will cause a drag on the society and the economy in life expectancy and in the cost of dealing with chronic disease in the future, and that countries who do not give the vaccine will actually have a much healthier population. And because there is no need for the vaccines now, that we have safe and effective prevention and treatment, there is no reason why the individual prime minister shouldn't be held to account. And the last thing is that we need to say that actually this messenger RNA does not meet the criteria of a vaccine. So even though we have been talking about a vaccine, it actually comes under more, because it's a micelle type structure with RNA. It actually is either a medical device type structure, or it comes under gene therapy, or it comes under treatment, right? It doesn't actually meet a vaccine because it doesn't really elicit a protective immune response, right? So therefore, it cannot, because it doesn't, it's a gene therapy or a medical device or a treatment, it doesn't actually legally come under the criteria for the exception caused by the kind of legislation, which means that the animal studies have to be done. And then at some stage, and the governments should be required to do that, and they would know, and their attorney generals have to know, that it is not a vaccine, and therefore it doesn't come under the legislation, and the people that die are preventable deaths, and they should not be terming it as a vaccine. It is not necessary, and the individual, ministers and the advisory boards will have to be held to account, because what we can't have is in another 2 years, we call it a similar unnecessary fear-mongering of a pandemic. Don't make the preventions and treatments available, and don't hold the ministers and the politicians and the police to account.
Well, Dolores, thanks a lot for taking such a long time to explain all of this, especially the end on the RNA, I would say, treatment, because I'm not going to call it vaccine. Otherwise, yes, I will have not listened to the professor that you are.
Thank you. And it actually makes us genetically modified organisms, and it will potentially integrate, and SARS-CoV-2 is expressed in the testes and around fertility. So there's a lot of evidence now that it will cause infertility and prevent proper implantation of babies. But it actually does, if you are expressing a viral DNA, you technically come under the term genetically modified organism. And when I realized they were fast tracking it, I looked up the European Union and Commission, and they changed the way genetically modified organisms were handled on the 17th of July, 2020, that people who get this are essentially genetically modified organisms. And there are legislation that those people can actually be controlled and patented under. I ran and would have had a license for genetically modified organisms. So they could potentially be told by their governments that they did not meet the criteria of men and women under the law, which has huge societal implications and potentially multi-generationally as well. So that needs to be stopped, really, that they are injecting, these treatments that make people into GMOs or genetically modified organisms.
Well, thank you very, very much for all of this. Dolores, you've really given us a wide array of explanation with respect to the pandemic, and especially some explanation on the RNA vaccine and the risk and consequences that could happen on ourselves, men and women, fertility, modification of our genes, and so on and so forth.
Maybe can I just give some web pages as well, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course, please. Or if you send them to me, I will include them in the.
I'll just tell them if that's okay. I was never on social media at all, but I now have a IFP Dolores Cahill is my Facebook page. I think I got 1 million views in December. I'm not really, on it, but someone is doing it on my behalf. So IFP Dolores Cahill on Facebook. Then dolorescahill.com, especially under videos, would have all of my videos. And then I have very honored to be setting up a new international airline at www.freedomairway.com. with 4 other people from America and Canada. And that will be to respect people's health sovereignty so that they can travel without masks and without being coerced into unnecessary PCR testing and vaccination, and that they cannot be locked up into forced quarantine by their governments, which infringes on their freedom of movement and freedom to work.
Wow, that's very impressive. And well, what we'll do is we'll write that into the bottom of the video as well. But thanks a lot, Dolores. I wish you a very nice evening. It's I know it's quite late, and I can only say thank you on behalf of the Francois readers and viewers for all your.
Thank you very much, and to all your listeners. Lovely to talk to you, Xavier. Thank you very much.